Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. And for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jeremy Peat, and I have the pleasure of being director of the David Hume Institute. And it is my huge pleasure today to welcome you to this seminar where our speaker is the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon. Now, this is the first of 5 sessions over the next 5 or 6 weeks, which we are holding with the leaders of the political parties at the Scottish Parliament, talking about issues raised by potential constitutional change. We very much left it to each of the speakers to determine what they want to cover, but we've asked each of them to speak for around 45 minutes and then to take questions for about half an hour. So that's the format for this evening. I'm extremely grateful to the RSC's Young Academy for working for us. With us, not for us. We certainly didn't pay them for it, did we? In delivering this series. And I'm also grateful to our 4 joint sponsors, the RICS, the Law Society of Scotland, the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries, and the Institute of Chartered Accountants of Scotland. So it's great to have them all involved, and I know there are a number of their representatives present here today. Now, the Deputy First Minister really needs no introduction, so let me just briefly state that she was born in Irvine and educated at Greenwood Academy and then studied law at the University of Glasgow. And after her LLB Hons and her diploma in legal practice, she actually worked as a solicitor in the Drumchapel Law and Money Advice Centre in Glasgow. Then she was elected MSP for Glasgow in 1999 and is now MSP for Glasgow Southside, where my father and his family hailed from. She was appointed Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Health and Wellbeing after the May 2007 election and is currently Deputy First Minister and Cabinet Secretary for Infrastructure, Investment and Cities. And we've all heard her talk. We've all been very impressed by listening to Nicola, and so I am looking forward immensely to hearing her today talking on the subject, which is up on the board there, a choice between 2 futures, why it is better for all of us if decisions about Scotland are taken in Scotland. So I'd ask you please to welcome our speaker tonight, the Deputy First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon.
Thank you very much indeed, Jeremy, for your introduction. Let me take this opportunity to thank all of you for being here this evening, and if it's not already too late in January, to wish you all a very happy and prosperous 2014. It is a real pleasure to be here and to kick off this series of seminars. As a former lawyer, I'm not sure it makes me feel entirely comfortable to have a member of the Law Society sitting within hurling distance of me in the front row here, but I'll take my chances. We open this series of seminars at the start of what, of course, will be a momentous year in Scotland. It's almost becoming a little bit cliched to say that, but it is nevertheless true. This is a year when all of us, each and every one of us, will have the opportunity to debate, to consider, and ultimately to choose the future of our country. I understand that one of the many notable events of 2014 will actually be Jeremy's retirement after 8 years as director of the David Hume Institute. So let me take this opportunity, Jeremy, to congratulate you on your success and to wish you all the best. When I said to Jeremy outside, I hear you're retiring this year, he said yes, in phases. So you can work out for yourself what that means. The Institute obviously is a very prestigious organisation, an excellent platform debate. So I'm very grateful to it and, of course, to the Young Academy for inviting me along here this evening to open this series of discussions. The aims of the Institute and the Young Academy are very relevant to all of us in Scotland as we look forward to this historic decision. The Institute is sceptical in Hume's sense of seeking to avoid dogma and preconception in addressing complex and important issues of public policy. And I very much believe that that is entirely the spirit in which Scotland should and will weigh up its big decision this year. There will be high feelings and passionate exchanges, of course. You already see plenty evidence of that. That's right and proper, for these are very serious and important issues. As David Hume himself said, reason is and ought only to be the slave of the passions and can never pretend to any other office than to serve and obey them. But the overwhelming appetite is for rational debate. I've got little doubt that the Scottish people will use their reason to guide their passions. And those of us most closely engaged in this debate have a real responsibility to conduct ourselves in a way that facilitates rational and reasonable discussion. I think we should consider, as we go through this year, how history will view us, the respect we show for our opponents and their arguments, the respect we show for our country and our friends and neighbours in considering our future. We owe it to ourselves and indeed to everyone in Scotland to lead a debate that Hume and his fellow Enlightenment thinkers would be proud of. The Young Academy's mission is to foster interdisciplinary activities among emerging leaders, to develop a coherent and influential voice, and to address the most challenging issues facing society in Scotland and beyond. For me, that mission statement underlines two profoundly important aspects of the independence debate. Firstly, independence does involve thinking about our country as a whole and differently. The opportunities that independence gives Scotland to take a truly interdisciplinary, joined-up, coherent approach to our problems and to make the most of our vast opportunities as a country. And secondly, independence is about the future. It's about the country that we want, not just in the here and now, but the kind of country we want for our children, our grandchildren, and for generations to come. And so, as well as established voices, young people and emerging leaders must be key voices in this debate. Now, this evening, I'm going to talk about the referendum as a choice between two futures, and I'm going to set out why I believe it's better for all of us if decisions about Scotland are taken here in Scotland. The choice that we will make on the 18th of September is different to the decisions that we are used to taking at the ballot box. It's not a choice between political parties with a programme for the country for the next 4 or 5 years. It's not, certainly not, in my view, a vote that should be based on party loyalty. It is instead a choice between two futures for our country. In one of those futures, we vote for independence. That means that decisions about Scotland are taken here in Scotland. Our Parliament, our already democratically elected Parliament, will have responsibility for all matters in our national life, the economy, welfare, taxation, and not just those matters devolved to it by Westminster. The Government of Scotland will reflect the views of its people across all of these issues of national life. In the other future, we vote no. That means decisions about Scotland's future will continue to be taken at Westminster. Decisions on taxation, on welfare, on replacing Trident or not, on staying in the EU or not, will be out of our hands and in the hands of others. So those, in summary, are the two futures Scotland faces. One in which we take responsibility and decide our own future, and one in which we wait for things to happen to us and can only mitigate the worst effects of decisions that we don't agree with or endorse. Last week, the Chancellor of the Exchequer made a speech on his plans for the next few years. He laid out quite clearly something of what the choice of a no vote would mean. He said, we've got to make more cuts, 17 billion this coming year, 20 billion next year, and over 25 billion further across the 2 years after. That's more than £60 billion in total. As he himself put it, what was hard won can be easily lost. So we have a choice in 2014. I think these are words that we would do well to heed, because it is clear from his comments that our welfare state and our public services, not to mention our budget and our place in Europe, could be in jeopardy if we vote no and continue to be governed from Westminster. But to strike a note of consensus, I did agree with the final thoughts that the Chancellor expressed in that speech. He said, so we can all live in a country that is in control of its own destiny in this world, a country where we can have the peace of mind that comes with knowing you can provide for your family, a country that offers security and a better life for the next generation. And as we contemplate the two futures that open up to us after the referendum, I firmly believe that these aims, control of our own destiny, providing security for families and for future generations, are at the very heart of this debate, and that they will be best served by a yes vote in September. Before I develop these two futures in more detail, I want to highlight a truth that underlies this debate, one that I describe as a truth because it is acknowledged by those on both sides of the debate, and that is that Scotland has got what it takes to be independent. Scotland can be a successful independent country. These are the actual words that were used by the Prime Minister, David Cameron. Our white paper, Scotland's Future, sets out very clearly the relative strengths of our economy and current financial position compared to the rest of the UK. Looking at our economy, even without North Sea oil and gas, even without any of that, economic output per head in Scotland is virtually identical to that of the UK as a whole. With oil and gas added in, it is considerably larger. So oil and gas is a huge bonus, but the Scottish economy also has key strengths in a range of different growth sectors: food and drink, energy, creative industries, tourism, life sciences. Per head of population, we have more top universities than any other country in the world. We perform strongly, incredibly strongly, as a location for inward investment, and we have a strong financial services industry. Looking at our public finances, in each and every one of the past 32 years, we've contributed more tax per head of population than the UK as a whole. When you take tax and spending together, over the past 5 years, our public finances have been stronger than the UK as a whole by a total of £12.6 billion. That's about £2,400 per head. And of course, the ratio of public spending to GDP has been lower for Scotland than in the UK. And as Scotland's Future sets out, at the point of independence in 2016, our estimated financial position continues to be relatively strong, healthier than the UK's as a whole. So I would argue that there is broad agreement, consensus even, on Scotland's fundamental economic and financial viability as an independent country. There's also agreement on other matters that are fundamental to the argument for an independent Scotland. Devolution in the limited areas that we already have responsibility for has worked. Taking decisions in Scotland rather than having decisions taken at Westminster on health, education, justice has brought real benefits to people living here. And independence, when you boil it all down, is about extending these benefits to all other areas of government activity. There's also agreement that after the referendum, whatever the result, both the Scottish and UK governments will work together in the best interests of people in Scotland and in the rest of the UK. That joint commitment is enshrined in the Edinburgh Agreement, although I would argue that it's no more than common sense and the way that nations across the world conduct their affairs. So that's why, regardless of what's said now in the heat of debate, and as you've probably noticed, this can be a very heated debate, but regardless of what's said in the heat of debate, we can be confident that following a yes vote, sensible agreement will be reached on issues like a currency union, because it's not just in Scotland's interest, it's in the mutual interests of Scotland and the rest of the UK. And we saw earlier this week, on Monday, with the Treasury's announcement about UK debt in the event of independence, the first clear acceptance by the UK government of the rational, common sense positions that are laid out in the white paper. It also demonstrated, that announcement, that clarity on matters like these is as much in the interests of the rest of the UK as it is in Scotland's interests. So my proposition is that if the UK government can accept the common sense position on debt, there is no reason, or there should be no reason, why they should not also accept the common sense position that Scotland and the rest of the UK should share a currency, or that Scotland's continuing membership of the EU can be agreed in the way we set out in the white paper. The barriers that the No campaign has sought to build fall down when they come up against simple logic, common sense and mutual self-interest. One of the specific questions that the Young Academy had asked me to address this evening concerns the future of research funding in an independent Scotland. And I actually believe that a continuing common research area is a very good example of where we would have continued cooperation after independence, because it's clearly in the interests of both Scotland and our partners in the rest of the UK to continue these arrangements, given the importance, and I should stress the importance not just for financial reasons, of collaboration in research. The international trend in research is towards greater collaboration, not just between the different countries of the UK, but between different countries in Europe and across the world. In the end, it's the excellence of the research carried out in our universities that will guarantee that it attracts funding, and it's in the mutual interest of Scotland and the rest of the UK that we will ensure that we remain within a common research area, with, of course, Scotland paying our full way in that arrangement. So as you make up your minds over these next few months, I would ask you to be clear about these key points of agreement. We can afford to be a successful independent country. We have very strong economic foundations. We have robust public finances. We already have a track record of running our country successfully. The principle of taking decisions here in Scotland has been tried and has been proven to work. And we will work with our friends and neighbours to make an independent Scotland a success. It will be in the interests of Scotland, the rest of the UK, and our partners in the European Union to ensure that we are two successful, friendly countries. So we can be independent if we so choose. I think that was settled in 2013, and despite the arguments you hear, I believe that is accepted. In 2014, we're debating the heart of the matter. Not can we be an independent country, but should we be an independent country? Our current strengths will give us the strongest possible starting point as an independent country if we vote yes in September. But as I said earlier on, the choice we face in the referendum is not about now, or not just about now, it is about the future. And not just the future for one parliamentary term, but the long-term good of our country and our people. Like other countries, including the UK, we face some big challenges. And I believe the need to meet these challenges provides one of the strongest arguments that we have for independence. Because the challenges we face, like constrained public finances, a legacy of debt, and a working population that isn't growing fast enough, are not arguments against independence. They are products of the status quo. They are the reasons not to keep things as they are, but to do things differently in future. So let's consider the first of Scotland's two futures. What future will Scotland have if we vote yes? The Scottish Government has set out in the White Paper a comprehensive vision and plan for how Scotland can change for the better with independence. It sets out three main objectives for independence: to create a more democratic Scotland, to build a more prosperous society, and to become a fairer country. With independence, we will get the governments we vote for in Scotland. In contrast, we are now governed from Westminster by a Conservative-led administration. In the last 4 UK general elections, the Tories have won in order 0, 1, 1 and 1 Westminster seats in Scotland. Yet they make right now the big decisions on our economy, welfare and tax systems, on whether nuclear weapons should be continue to be based in our country. Now, I appreciate that that might sound like an anti-Tory point, and I'm not a pro-Tory politician, so you'll forgive me for it. But it is more fundamentally a pro-democracy point. For the leader of any party that has comprehensively lost the election to end up as Prime Minister, I would argue, is neither right nor democratic. But the democratic argument goes beyond simple parliamentary representation. It is about a fundamentally different view of the sort of country Scotland should be. A Scotland where we don't wait for things to happen to us, but one where we accept responsibility and shape our own future. Independence has the transformational potential to empower our country and our people, to make all of us individually and collectively face up to take responsibility for our own future. And I believe that is the overriding reason to vote yes. And how can independence make us a more prosperous country? Well, first we should look around us. Our independent neighbours have grown their economies more quickly than we have. Scotland's Future and the accompanying economic paper sets out the opportunities that independence can bring to improve our economy and build on the current strengths that we have. These range from industrial policies that will promote innovation and manufacturing to using tax powers and our new global status to develop growth sectors, widen our export base and attract investment. Scotland's Future also identifies some very specific early priorities that this government would pursue if we were elected to be the first government of an independent Scotland. And of course we might not be, but let's assume for the purposes of the next couple of paragraphs of this speech that we are. If we were that government, we would set a competitive corporation tax, we'd reduce air passenger duty by 50%, things designed to get our economy growing. Now, another vital area for improving our economic performance, as well as addressing the challenge of an increasing pensioner population, is the size of our working population. You hear lots of commentary about how it's a terrible problem that people are living longer. It's not a problem that people are living longer, it's fantastic that people are living longer. What the challenge for us is to grow our working age population at a rate that supports that growth in our pensioner population. Historically, our population has grown less quickly than the UK's as a whole, and less quickly than countries like Switzerland, Ireland, Sweden and Norway. With independence, we could take steps to address what is a crucial issue with, for example, a sensible and managed immigration policy suited to our needs, not suited to the needs of the southeast of England. We could take action to help more women into work. You'll be aware that in Scotland's Future we set out a very ambitious plan to transform childcare. That's not just about improving the early education of our children or helping families, vitally important though both of these aspects are. It's also an important economic policy. You know, if we can raise female participation in the labour market to levels already achieved in, for example, Sweden, then as well as a boost to general economic performance, we'd raise an extra £700 million per year in tax revenue. Now, with devolution, we've been able to increase the amount of childcare that's available. We announced a further extension just last week. But with independence, we'd have the ability to go beyond this and deliver our ambitious plans for the provision of free universal education for all children from the ages of 1 to when they go to primary school at age 5. And I want to be crystal clear why we argue that independence is required to deliver that transformation for our children, for women and families, and for our economy. At the moment, Scotland receives a fixed budget from Westminster. We wouldn't receive the increased tax revenues from more women in the workforce unless Westminster decided that we should. So the cost of providing increased childcare with devolution would have to be met from within that fixed budget by cutting other services. With independence, the cost can be met initially by making different decisions on defence, and those decisions are laid out in the white paper, and then over the longer term, because increased tax revenues that flow from the policy stay in Scotland to enable it to be sustainable for the longer term. So transforming childcare, increasing female participation in the workforce, boosting our working age population and economic performance is a social and economic transformation that is only possible if we have the powers of an independent government. And of course, that principle that I've just outlined in relation to childcare doesn't just apply to that policy. It would apply also to investment in education, training, infrastructure, transport. The economic benefits and the benefits to public finances of all of these policies stay in Scotland with independence, and they flow to the Treasury with devolution. And that's a fundamental change in the way we approach our economy and public services. Independence is the difference between being a country that takes responsibility and enjoys the benefits and indeed bears the risks of our own decisions, or being treated as just another department of the Westminster government that has its budget decided for it and doled out to it. Another key area where independence would allow us to transform Scotland is in the fairness of our society. Within the UK, right now, Scotland is part of an increasingly unequal society. The UK is one of the most unequal countries in the developed world. OECD analysis shows that since 1975, income inequality amongst working age people has increased faster in the UK than in any other country in the OECD. That's not the result of policies of one government, but of almost 40 years of decisions being taken at Westminster. And seeking to become a more equal society, I would argue, is not just the right thing to do. It also makes hard sense for the economy. We know that the most equal societies also have the highest levels of well-being and are more prosperous. But welfare is currently reserved, and the changes that are being made to our welfare system, including the quite disastrous rollout of universal credit and the grossly unfair bedroom tax, are being decided for us. With independence, we can build on the record of successive Scottish governments and deliver a coherent approach to social justice and to tackling inequality. We can seek to build solidarity and cohesion within our society. This government recognises that everyone contributes to society and everyone should take some benefit. That's one of the reasons that we support universal provision of some benefits and services. We don't believe that society should be divided between those that pay in and those that take out. So with independence, we can build a welfare system based on clear principles and values, one that supports people into work, provides support for people who can't work, and fosters a climate of social solidarity. We can build on our pioneering approach of preventing problems arising in the first place rather than relying on crisis interventions. Now, there'll be immediate gains from independence, again, if my party is the government of an independent Scotland, such as the abolition of the bedroom tax and a halt to universal credit. But the main benefits will come over time as we realise these fundamental transformations to our welfare system and increase fairness in our communities and our country. Of course, there's much, much more to fairness and equality than welfare. This Scottish Government already promotes a living wage to make sure that people who are in work can have a decent standard of living. With independence, we would increase the minimum wage at least in line with inflation, so those at the bottom end of the pay scale don't fall further behind. Investment in childcare and social housing can also have longer-term positive impacts for individuals and communities, reducing the need for expensive interventions through the justice and health systems later in life. This approach can create savings for the long term that with independence can be reinvested for the benefit of people in Scotland in the future and provide sustained benefits to individuals and to communities. So these are the kinds of positive transformations that I believe Scotland could achieve with a yes vote. A fairer Scotland with a welfare system that promotes solidarity and treats those in need with respect and dignity, a minimum wage that reflects the cost of living, and a joined-up approach to policy that realises for Scotland the benefits of the investments we make. A prosperous country with control of the economy and taxes and the tools to address challenges like our working age population, and a democratic Scotland where the government represents the views of the people and where we take responsibility and make things happen for ourselves. And it's with that idea of responsibility, of making things happen for ourselves, that I want to address another of the specific questions that the Young Academy posed for me this evening, the question of where the biggest risks and opportunities lie. You know, for many people living in Scotland today, under the system we have right now, the risks are really great. Not because we have too much responsibility, but because we have too little. In wealthy Scotland, one of the richest countries in the world, many of our fellow citizens rely on food banks. Children risk being brought up in poverty. Working families risk taking the brunt of the planned spending cuts that I spoke about earlier on. And these risks are growing. For far too many, it's not even just a matter of risk, it is the reality. These things are happening in Scotland now, today, and in a country that is ranked in the top 10 wealthiest countries in the OECD. The risks and the reality come from the dismantling of the social security safety net and the imposition of social and economic policies that are out with our control, often decided by a government we don't vote for. So yes, taking responsibility in any aspect of our personal or our national life can seem daunting. But I would argue, and I would argue very strongly, that it is much, much less of a risk to be in control of your own decisions, in charge of your own destiny, than it is to leave that responsibility in the hands of others. And I make these points because, as I said earlier, as the title of my speech tonight signifies, the referendum is a choice between two futures. And that means that the consequences of both a yes vote and a no vote need to be considered. Scotland's future is the case for independence, and I'm very happy to let the people of Scotland be the judge of it. But to make an informed choice, you also need to know what a no vote will mean for Scotland. So far, the No campaign has told us a lot about why they think independence, taking responsibility here in Scotland, is bad. But they haven't yet told us why they think continued government by Westminster is good. There are many questions about what will happen in the event of a no vote, and so far, I would argue, these go completely unanswered. Last week I set out some of it. On Monday, actually, I set out 50 of them, but I'm going to spare you about 40 odd of them this evening. But last week I set out what I think are some of the key questions that you, the public of Scotland, have a right to know answers to before you determine how you vote. So, for example, what new powers is the Scottish Parliament guaranteed to get if we vote no? Given that there is no consensus on this within the various anti-independence parties, let alone between these different parties. Will the Barnett formula be retained for the long term? Or will the demands that we now hear from politicians in all of the UK parties for it to be reviewed or scrapped lead to a cut in Scotland's budget? What will the implications be for Scottish families of the £25 billion of additional cuts in public spending that were announced by the Chancellor last week? How many more children will be living in poverty in 2020 if we carry on down the current Westminster policy path? How much will Scottish taxpayers be expected to contribute to the replacement of Trident nuclear weapons? Now, there are no direct answers so far from the Westminster Government to these questions, but we can piece together some answers from the information publicly available. For example, it's estimated that up to 100,000 more children in Scotland will be living in poverty by the year 2020 if we follow the policy path that Westminster is on. But the fundamental truth that underlies all of these questions, and why I would argue that they are directly relevant to the debate on the referendum, is that if we vote no, it won't be Scotland that decides any of these matters, it will be Westminster. I mean, let's just take one of the questions I posed about the future of the Barnett formula, the formula that determines how much money the Scottish Parliament has at its disposal. Back in December, the Prime Minister wrote to the First Minister on the future of the Barnett formula, and he stated in pretty bald terms that he couldn't bind his successors on this issue. And that's precisely the point. With independence, we'll retain the taxes raised here, we'll make our own decisions on how to raise those taxes and on what we choose to spend them on. Under Westminster, the Barnett formula can't be guaranteed. It could be changed tomorrow with or without the support of people in Scotland, and we couldn't do anything about it. And of course, while Scottish politicians in the No campaign want us to continue to be governed from Westminster, we often hear their colleagues south of the border, speaking to different audiences, of course, illustrate the damage that's been done by the policies of that very system. Labour's Shadow Health Secretary in the UK says that the privatisation of the NHS is underway in England and will have irreversible consequences. The Shadow Education Secretary says that the approach of the Tories to the welfare state reeks of the 1800s. The Shadow Business Minister says that we face a return to the poorhouse of the 19th century. Policies are imposed on Scotland even when they have been opposed by our elected Westminster MPs. And I would argue that the answer surely can't be just to cross our fingers and hope for a different government in Westminster. There is a better alternative to hoping for the opposition to triumph in Westminster elections and then being disappointed when they don't, or being disappointed sometimes even when they do, but carry on with much of the same policy agenda regardless. The alternative is to vote yes and to make these decisions for ourselves. I want to touch on two other aspects of the alternative future Scotland faces before I finish this evening. The first relates to the dominance of London and the southeast of England in the UK economy, an issue which causes concern across the political spectrum. David Cameron says that such a narrow foundation for growth is unstable. The Business Secretary, Vince Cable, said just before Christmas in the colourful language that he's become renowned for, that London is like a huge suction machine draining the life out of the rest of the country. The gap in economic performance between different regions in the UK is larger than in any other EU country. In practical terms, that means jobs and opportunities are increasingly concentrated in London. I love London, it's a fantastic global city, but that's not healthy for the rest of the country. So the question for Scotland is, what arrangements best equip us to level that playing field and to secure greater job opportunities and long-term economic security? Is it continuing as a region of an unbalanced economy with one of the biggest gaps between rich and poor in the developed world and lacking the economic powers we need to create the incentives for growth? Or is it becoming a national economy with the full range of economic powers to take advantage of our great strengths? Who is more likely to plan successfully for Scotland's future economy? Who's more likely to exercise responsible stewardship of our hydrocarbons to maximise their economic life? Who's more likely to consider the needs of our rural and island communities? A Scottish Government in Edinburgh focused on the needs of the Scottish economy, or a Westminster Government implementing a one-size-fits-all policy regardless of the distinctive circumstances of different parts of the UK? And the other issue I want to touch on is the role that I believe Scotland should have in the international community. Should we have the status of a region lobbying Westminster in the hope that the UK government will protect our interests and promote our values, with the fishing minister from the Scottish government having to ask permission to speak in council and ministers' meetings, even though he represents the interests of our fishing industry? Or should we have the powers and the status of an independent country able to engage directly with the international community? The other side in this debate has spent a great deal of time discussing Scotland's place in the European Union in the event of a yes vote. They've been less keen to talk about what might happen to our membership of the EU in the event of a no vote. And that's not surprising, because the hard fact is we don't know. We don't have a clear answer to that. The Prime Minister is pledging an in-out referendum by 2017. Before that, he wants to renegotiate Britain's relationship with the European Union. We don't know precisely what he wants to renegotiate, and we don't know if he'll recommend withdrawal if he doesn't get what he wants. We obviously don't know what the result of a referendum in Europe might be. It is perfectly possible that a majority of people in Scotland would vote to stay in the EU, but that a majority elsewhere in the UK would vote to come out. What we do know is that when Westminster is deciding UK European policy, Scotland's interests are rarely at the top of the list of considerations. It's pretty clear that David Cameron has other priorities. He cares about internal Tory party management. He cares that his party is losing votes to UKIP. He cares about trying to outmanoeuvre the Labour Party. He doesn't seem to care about Scotland in that mix. If he did, I don't think he'd be playing Westminster political games with our future in Europe. Last week, that future was in the hands of peers in the House of Lords. And that's the reality of keeping power at Westminster, the reality of the consequences of voting no, the future of jobs and businesses in Scotland being determined by the internal interests of a political party with one Scottish Member of Parliament and by a chamber with no elected representatives from anywhere. I don't think that is the best way to run a country. In an independent Scotland, the government of whatever colour that government might be will always surely put the interests of Scotland first. And the current Scottish Government believes those interests lie in being a full member of the European Union. Today we've published some research showing that if we were an independent member state, we would benefit from an extra £850 million in common agricultural policy funding. That's a massive amount of money that we lose out on simply because we do not have the status of independent member state. That money would support an additional 2,500 jobs. It would increase economic output by £1 billion. Now, in Scotland's future, we set out a route through which Scotland would negotiate its continued membership of the EU between the time of a yes vote and Scotland becoming an independent country. It's a timescale that the UK's own advisor has said is realistic. Eminent legal experts like the former British judge at the European Court of Justice, Sir David Edwards, someone who I have to say describes himself as a moderate unionist, so not somebody that can be said to be necessarily on my side in these arguments. He says there's an obligation on behalf of EU member states to negotiate Scotland's continued membership from within. Fact is, there's no provision in any EU treaty to remove 5 million EU citizens against their will, simply because we've chosen a particular path through a democratic process. And whatever the No campaign might say about Scotland being chucked out of the EU, we discovered today that they really believe something else. Last week, the No campaign appointed Professor Jim Gallagher as a policy advisor, and last year he wrote this: "It seems pretty likely that Scotland would be an EU member state, probably after an accelerated set of accession negotiations. Precisely what the conditions of membership would be is not quite so clear, though immediate requirements to join the Euro or the Schengen Agreement can surely be avoided." Now, there are differences between my view and those of Professor Gallagher, but I welcome the effective dismissal of one of the wilder scare stories of this debate. And whatever is said in public from now on, we know that people at the heart of the No campaign don't really believe that Scotland's independent membership of the EU is in doubt, and we know they accept that the requirement to join Schengen or the Euro can be avoided. My argument for our continued membership of the EU rests principally on common sense and on the very purpose of the European Union. And I think it's time to get real in this debate, to stop pretending that the European Union is something that it isn't. The EU isn't in the business of throwing out its citizens, of ignoring democratic processes. It's founded on the principles of democracy, of mutual cooperation among countries and citizens who share the European ideal. The European Union is engaged in a process of enlargement, not contraction. So we accept there will be negotiations. That's what all member states do, negotiate in their own interests and in the interests of the EU as a whole. We fully accept our obligations, but the process we are engaged in is supported by both the Scottish and the UK governments. It's lawful and it's based on democratic principles. Both governments say they will respect the result, and in such circumstances, the basis for saying that the EU and its member states would seek to find a way to remove an independent Scotland is simply not credible. And I think if there is a duty on all of us in this campaign, it is to make sure that we argue rational positions and put forward credible arguments to allow people to have a genuinely informed choice. To conclude, ladies and gentlemen, I think we are, whatever side of the debate you are on, yes, no, or like many people, still undecided, we're very lucky and privileged, I think, to be the generation and the people who are participating in this debate, to have the opportunity to think about our country anew, to think about what we want the future of our country to be and how we think we can best deliver, create, build that kind of country. And as we think about the issues and about how we will vote, I think we should think about how generations to come will judge the decision we take. I think we should think about the two futures that Scotland can choose and the country that we want to build for our children and our grandchildren. I believe that the best way of building a successful Scotland is to take our future into our own hands, to be in the driving seat of our own destiny. I believe that it will be better for all of us if decisions about Scotland are taken by the people who care most, those of us who live and work here, those of us who've got the biggest stake in making Scotland as successful as we can be. Independence will equip not just the first Scottish government, but Scottish governments to come of any party with the means and the tools to ensure greater long-term economic security, more job opportunities and a fairer society. In short, to transform our country for the better. If we vote no, we won't have that opportunity. Power will remain elsewhere, and decisions that could transform Scotland for the worse. Decisions not supported by a majority of people living here will be taken for us. So at the beginning of this most important and most exciting of years, I've got absolutely no doubt that you will think very carefully about the consequences of voting yes. But I would ask you also to think very carefully about the consequences of voting no. I ask you to look carefully at the Scottish Government's detailed blueprint for an independent Scotland, and then ask yourself this question: will it be better for me, my family, for generations to come if decisions about Scotland continue to be taken at Westminster, or will it be better if they're taken here in Scotland instead? That's the question at the heart of this debate. Thank you very much indeed for listening, and I look forward to answering your questions.
Well, Nicola, thank you very much for that lucid, persuasive and thorough presentation to us. We have 2 roving mics which have now appeared. I'm aware there are some people in the overflow room, and if they wish to ask questions, please will they come out of the door and wave at me, and I will try to give them preference. Now, I'd ask a couple of points of people asking questions. First of all, please state who you are and any designation you wish to give. Secondly, will you speak into the microphone, because the acoustics in this room are much better if you do that. Thirdly, will you be relatively brief, please? And can we have questions which are intended to deliver light rather than heat to the debate, as Nicola has suggested, and not long, complex and convoluted comments, which I'll leave you to provide when we have a glass of wine later to anyone you can capture who's prepared to listen.
All of that to the answers as well.
Well, that goes without saying, I'm sure. So, if we could have the indications of who would like to kick us off. I'm looking behind. There's a gentleman in the middle here, and there's another hand slightly further down. So if we can get the 2 mics to those 2 people, and I should say that I reserve the right to take up the chairman's prerogative of asking at certain stages. But if you could kick us off by saying who you are and a quick question, please.
Junaid Ashraf, Scottish Youth Parliament. Following a yes or no vote, would your party commit to work to enfranchise 16 and 17-year-olds in all future Scottish Parliament, local authorities, community council elections and referendums in Scotland?
Thank you. That's lovely and to the point. We'll take the second question and then I'll ask Nicola to deal with those 2.
Thomas Ward, you talk passionately about the importance of the welfare state in Scotland, and clearly you see it as prospectively currently being a little bit on the mean side, and you wish it to be slightly more generous, slightly more fulsome in the way it operates. If you look at the figures for welfare spending in Scotland, the big items on pensions, child benefit, invalidity benefit, and so forth, they're probably currently the highest percentage of GNP in Scotland that they've ever been. At what level do you think would be the appropriate level for Scotland? And why is it you think that the increased expenditure would actually end up being self-funding through increased tax revenue? This wonderful position, we can have more, but actually in the end, we don't have to pay for it.
Thank you.
Okay. Junaid, in response to your question, the answer is yes. My party believes in votes at 16. We think if you can get married and have kids at 16, you should also be able to vote. We don't have power to set the age of the franchise for all elections at the moment. We've done it in some smaller elections where we've had power, and of course we've extended the franchise in the referendum to 16-year-olds. So if that power is devolved through independence to the Scottish Parliament, then I would certainly be in favour of extending that to Scottish Parliament elections, to local elections and to any other elections that there are in Scotland. Thomas, in terms of I should say first of all, I don't believe in I believe passionately in the welfare state, and I should say by the welfare state, I don't just mean benefits for people who are out of work, or when I talk about the welfare state, I talk about the health service, I talk about our education system, and I actually think one of the opportunities we've got is to see the welfare state in that broader context, to take more of a social investment approach to welfare. If we invest in children when they're very young through childcare, if we make sure they get a decent education, then we make it possible for them to get into good jobs and be less reliant, or less possibility of them being reliant on welfare in future. So I see it in that broader context. Just in terms of our current welfare spend as a proportion of our GDP currently, it's actually a lower proportion of GDP than is the case for the UK as a whole, marginally. I don't take the view that we should set a particular target for we want to spend X% of our GDP or GNP on welfare. I think we should have a welfare state that is fit for purpose, one that helps people into work, making sure that work pays. I mean, a huge proportion of what is termed the welfare budget right now goes on people who are working, but they get tax credits or other support because they are in jobs that don't pay well. So we need to support people into work and make sure that work pays. But I also think we should support people that need help, that there should be a decent safety net. And some of the objections I have to what is happening through the welfare changes, reforms, cuts, call them what you like, that are happening from Westminster at the moment, is that they're penalising some of the most vulnerable people in our society. Disabled people are being hit really hard by these cuts. People affected by the bedroom tax are obviously are often in a position where they can do nothing about it. They either accept the cut or they end up in rent arrears because they don't have options to move to smaller houses. So they're targeted at the wrong people. We need a welfare state that is fit for purpose. And if we have a system where we're supporting people into work, then you do create tax revenue that can stay and be reinvested in the future. So it's not an end in itself. It's what we need in a civilised society to support the economy and make sure that we're supporting people who need support, often through absolutely no fault of their own.
Can I just ask one follow-up on that one, please? Which is that I think in what you said today and in the white paper, the assumption is that spending more on the welfare side will, in due course, become self-funding. So it's not just a matter of preferring a more equal society for its own sake, but because it's good for the economy more generally. Now, I suspect that it would take time for that self-funding to come through. So there's a lag and a period when the public finances would have to cope with higher expenditure. But I suppose my question is more general than that, which is, do you actually believe that it would be right for Scotland to seek a more equal society, even if that did not bring wider economic benefits? Is that something that, in its own sake, is part of your preference for Scotland?
Yes, I believe that we should seek a more equal society because it's the right thing to do. I think wide gaps between the richest and the poorest in society are not right. I think they're unhealthy for a whole variety of reasons, but there is the added benefit, and there's a wealth of evidence now to support this, that the more equal your society is, the more economically prosperous it is likely to be, and the greater well-being there will be. In terms of the first part of your question, Jeremy, I mean, we set out, I'm not going to start reading huge tracts of the white paper to you, you'll be pleased to know, but we set out, you know, the different spending decisions we would take in the first year, in the first Parliament of an independent Scotland if we were in government. So on childcare, for example, we accept that there are different decisions that would have to be made in terms of spending priorities to fund that initially. We would spend less on defence. We actually spend way in excess of what is actually delivered in defence in Scotland right now. So we spend less in the initial term, but that tax revenues that flow from a policy help to make policies like that sustainable in the longer term.
Thank you. Let's have a couple more questions. There are two hands at the back there. So what I'm going to do is take the one directly next to you, and then there's someone just in front. There was a hand just in front, was there? Here. So if we could get the second mic moved across here, but if we can start off with this first lady.
Thank you. Carol Fox, employment lawyer. Nicola, I hugely welcome the attention that you've brought to the childcare initiative. What I'm more concerned about is the lack of current laws we have. We don't have any right for mothers to have flexible working or part-time working. And I haven't been able to find in the white paper any commitment to have a transformation in the workplace as well as a transformation in childcare. Could you perhaps advise more on what you intend to do to embed equality in the workplace?
Okay, we'll take the second question as well.
My name's Ian Ritchie. I'm the Vice President for Business at the Royal Society here. Sorry, I'm over here. And I'd like to look at the other aspect of fiscal policy, which is the support for business and entrepreneurial activity and enterprise and so forth. The current fiscal position in the UK is that it's the best country in the world for enterprise. You know, the capital gains tax, or entrepreneur relief, there's enterprise investment scheme for investors in risk capital and early stage companies and so forth. So we have a very, very strong position for enterprise in Scotland, in the UK rather. Is that the kind of situation that you would like to encourage and persist as an independent country?
Okay. Sorry, that wasn't me, was it?
Don't worry.
Carol, I think you raise a good point. The white paper, again, I'm not going to read you tracts of it, but there's a lot there on, you know, the proposal to have a Fair Work Commission, for example, to make sure that we are promoting a model of work that is good for the economy, but also recognises the rights and responsibilities of those in the workplace. And you know, things like flexible part-time working, I think, are built into that kind of view of how that collaborative way of working between employers and employees that we want to foster. But childcare, I think, is so fundamentally important to supporting women into any kind of work that it is absolutely right that we've put the strongest emphasis in the white paper on that transformational plan for childcare. But it's not an either-or situation. I think you're right to point to the lack of flexibility relative to other European countries in the UK just now around some of these things. But you know, that kind of approach is very much at the heart of our thinking. Ian, yes is the short answer. You know, we, through the devolved powers that we have just now, which are very, very limited, have exercised those powers to try to create a very positive business environment. The example that I will give you is what we've done through small business rates. You know, we have the most generous package of business rates relief, I think, in any part of the UK. We've taken some of our smallest businesses, many of our smallest businesses, tens of thousands of them, out of business rates altogether. We've reduced business rates for many, many more. So that's, you know, one of the very few tax powers that we have, and that's how we've exercised it. At the point of independence, unless we say that we're going to change something, all of the tax rates and exemptions and reliefs that are currently in place would continue to be in place. And you know, we've been very explicit in the white paper about the things we would change. Until things change, they stay as they are. One of the things we think there is a massive opportunity to do is to simplify the tax system. The UK tax system is one of the most complex in the world, and there is an opportunity there to simplify it and probably to increase your tax take as a result, as you make sure people pay the tax that they are due to pay. But you know, a positive business environment is very much at the top of our list of priorities, because we recognise that if we want the social justice policies that we do want, then we need to have a strong economy that are paying for them.
Okay. Let's take another couple of questions. There's a gentleman here, and there's one hand went up. Sorry, it was just behind you there. The hand went up there first. Okay, so if we take those two, and then we'll take a couple more in a moment. Yes, sir.
Alistair Drysdale, retired diver and chartered accountant. Quick comment and a quick question. Good idea getting more women into work, but you will get quite a high degree of substitution when you do that. It won't all be incremental. The question is, Scots built the world, and there's hordes of them out there doing good work, but they do need support. At present, we have UK consulates and embassies. What are your plans for Scottish consulates and embassies around the world?
And the second question?
Hi, Derek Chan. I'm part of the, here as a member of the Institute and Faculty of Actuaries. So in everyday life,
That's it, you're coming through loud and clear.
So everyday life we make decisions, and there's pluses and minuses. So that for a rational debate, we need to know the pluses and minuses. So Nicola, have you got any minuses of Scotland becoming an independent Scotland? Do you have any? So, you know, it can't be all pluses, for example.
It would be an actuary that asks about pluses and minuses, wouldn't there? So, two good questions for you.
Okay, I'll start with the second one first. You know, there's a big minus. Would have nobody else to blame. I couldn't stand here and blame the Westminster government for anything that went wrong. I'm not being facetious or flippant about that. You know, whether it's in your personal life or the life of a country, being responsible for yourself, of course, brings risks as well as opportunities. But just as I'm sure there are none of us in this room would hand over, you know, control of our lives and our day-to-day decisions or our salary at the end of the month to our neighbour and allow our neighbour to decide how we run our life. No matter how much we like and love and want to be close and have a close relationship with our neighbour, we wouldn't do that. And the same is true, I think, of the way we conduct our national life. So, you know, it's always, I said it in my remarks, it's always a bit daunting to think about taking responsibility for yourself. But I think it's a far better way to be and to live than to hand responsibility over. It's, you know, in any walk of life, being in control. You know, the most stressful situations any individual can have is when they're not in control of a situation. Being in control and being in charge of the decisions you take, I think, is always the better way to be. But the downside, as I say, is you don't have anybody else to blame when things go wrong. Alistair...
Can I just quickly follow up on that? I'm sorry. What, if you're not going to identify a minus other than the no one else to blame, what worries you most? I'm genuinely not trying to dodge this. She's desperately tries to think how she's going to dodge it. What worries me most right now is that we don't take this opportunity, and because we might never get it again. And, you know, Scotland, if we are independent, you know, and I've been quite explicit about that, independence, I suppose what worries me about how we sometimes perhaps seem as if we're articulating our arguments is that independence makes us immune from challenges in the future. It doesn't. You know, we face big challenges just like other countries do. We will no doubt, like every other country, you know, have rocky periods. We'll have times when things don't go right. These are, you know, things that worry politicians and governments in any country, but I cannot, for the life of me, think of the situation in which I think it would be better to leave responsibility elsewhere than to have responsibility for navigating your way through these things and finding the solutions for ourselves. And, you know, genuinely what worries me more than anything at the moment is we don't take this opportunity because we genuinely might not get it again. Thank you. And the other question?
Sorry, the other question was about consulates. Again, I should have brought loads of copies of the white paper in case anybody doesn't have them. You can still download it or order it free of charge from the Scottish Government. We set out in exhaustive detail in here what the network of consulates would be across the world, and you know, we wouldn't be starting from, you know, the UK embassy network, which does good work, and I'm not suggesting it doesn't, is to some extent, you know, the UK's got embassies in pretty much every country in the world. Some of that is legacy of empire rather than, you know, what is really needed for the economic interests of the country. Our consulate embassy network would be very much focused on the economic interests and the economic priorities of the country, and that would guide the locations. We set out some of the initial locations that we would prioritise in the white paper. Clearly, we've got a duty to protect citizens. But the other point I would make, the final point in this respect, is, you know, countries share embassies more routinely these days. I mean, it's not that long ago, I think it was just last year when the UK signed an agreement with Canada to share embassy facilities. So, you know, and any European citizen can go to any embassy of another European country. So the trend is towards sharing, but our absolute focus would be on representing industry, promoting our economy, and making sure our citizens were protected. But I can give you my copy away later on if you want to read the exact locations.
Okay, two more questions. The lady down here is first, and then we'll go directly behind her to Peter. So.
An observation on that. That almost renders your overseas representative... Sorry, Anne Packard. That almost renders your embassies overseas trade missions, doesn't it, rather than embassies or consulates? My question, if I may, is currently in the devolved Parliament, it is unicameral. What real, appropriate, cost-effective checks and balances will there be in the event of independence? Because a unicameral authority seems to me potentially to grasp too much power onto itself.
Okay, just as... Can we just have Peter read these? Oh, sorry, my apologies.
A lot of the beginning of your speech used the word "our" for Scotland. Does it depend in this debate on who you see as being our? So if you were sitting in a city in Scotland, you might say that we would like to have responsibility for the taxes in our city so that we could make the decisions. How do you see that hierarchy of decision making in Europe, in Scotland, in cities after independence?
Okay. Before I come on to your question about unicameral parliament, the white paper sets out 5 core functions that we would envisage for our embassies: commercial, governmental, so they're engaging with other governments, cultural, development and consular. So, clearly there would be a very big economic focus, but it wouldn't be exclusively economic, and that's set out in there. In terms of your point about the structure of our Parliament, we don't propose any change to how the current devolved Parliament is structured, so we're not proposing a change to a bicameral Parliament with an upper house if we become independent. I should say one of the other things we propose is a written constitution for Scotland and a very participative and inclusive process of drawing up that written constitution. And who knows, it may be that in the course of that process there would be proposals to change the nature and the structure of the Parliament, but I don't argue for that, and I don't propose that. I think our Parliament right now, and independence would be about giving that Parliament more powers. I think the checks and balances in our Parliament work not perfectly, but I think they work reasonably well. We've got a strong and reasonably respected committee system, so the emphasis in our Parliament is on pre-legislative scrutiny rather than on post-legislative, or having an upper chamber like the House of Lords that has a part in the legislative process like that. So I think it works well, and I think it would work well in an independent Scotland as well. If you're asking me to be honest about where I think, and this doesn't really just apply to independence, it could equally apply to the Scottish Parliament just now, is that we've got very good pre-legislative scrutiny through our committees. I'm not sure that there isn't a case, and I don't think this should be done through a second chamber, but probably through our committees in some other way, to have some kind of post-legislative oversight of Acts of Parliament. I remember sitting when I was in opposition, I think it was back in fact, Michael, I think you might have been involved in this bill, the mental health legislation at the time. Massive piece of legislation. I was on the health committee at the time, and I remember being struck, as I think we all were, at how quickly that committee rattled through hundreds and hundreds of amendments. And inevitably, with that kind of exercise, you're going to get something wrong. And there's not a process on the other side of legislation, maybe a year or 5 years afterwards, to look at it routinely and say, did we get all that right or wrong, and is there a need to review it? So there are some changes, independent or otherwise, that could be made, but I don't favour a double chamber Parliament. And Peter, your question about... It's a good question. I mean, I use the term "our" to refer to Scotland as the nation. But there's already a healthy debate within Scotland about the powers cities should have. I co-chair the Scottish Cities Alliance. There's a very healthy debate about how cities should be empowered to maximise their own growth and potential. We've got an ongoing piece of work just now to look at our island communities and what powers and responsibilities would rightly sit with islands. I don't support independence just so that we can transfer power from Westminster to Holyrood. I think there is an ongoing process of making sure power lies at the most appropriate level, be that Edinburgh, cities, island authorities, and I think that's quite a healthy debate that we'll have in the run-up to the referendum, and I'm sure we'll continue to have after it as well.
Thank you very much. You're happy to take a few more? Right, there are some arms at the back, so there are two arms together there at the back, if we could take those two. Yes, two hands. But it's not the same person, I don't think. If those two we can take, and then what we might do is squeeze in a third one in the cycle, which is the gentleman on the back row. So if we can take those three quick questions, if that's not taxing too much. Okay, away we go.
Victor Wood, McInroy and Wood. Minister, I'd like to ask you about financial education. In the white paper, in the section on education, you refer, of course, to the curriculum for excellence, and you go on to say that you will provide the ability to tackle head-on the issues that have blighted generations in the curriculum and elsewhere. You're, of course, aware of the background to problems that we've had in Scotland, centering on the banks, which indeed have blighted generations, and would have brought the country to its knees but for the support of the British taxpayer. So you'll be well aware, I'm sure, of the critical importance of financial education as a protection for tomorrow's generations. And my question is, how do you propose to give financial education the priority it deserves?
Thank you. The second question now.
I'm Bruce Beveridge. I'm president of the Law Society of Scotland. Maury did some polling at the very start of December, which we asked him to do about how people felt about the debate so far. And there are just two pieces of information I'd like to ask your view on. Despite the amount of information that is out there already, only 14% of respondents said they felt well informed at the moment about the debate, and that fell to 10% for women. And almost 2/3 of respondents said they couldn't make up their mind whether or not the information they were given was true. I was just interested to know whether you think the debate needs to evolve and in what way, and what your thoughts would be on how to address these in the next 8 months.
Clearly more David Hume Institute events as part of that. But the gentleman there. Gentleman there.
Martin McAdam, Chief Executive of Aquamarine Power. One of the challenges that I've had with the debate is what somebody referred to as the lack of debate and plus and minus points on both sides. And the white paper, as you published it, was criticized for being aspirational. And I'm delighted to hear that you have 50 questions for the No campaign to answer, and I would like to see that done. But my real question is in relation to businesses. Organizations such as the CBI have said that they don't like the concept of independence and they're essentially anti it. Who, therefore, can we look to put forward, and where is the media debate in relation to the positive aspects or the opportunities which independence would create for businesses in Scotland?
Thank you very much.
Okay, Victor, I think financial education is very important, and I think it should be, and in a sense this is the case whether or not we're independent through the curriculum. I think there should be more of a focus on that, as well as what you've referred to in the white paper about financial education in the curriculum. In the pension section of the white paper, we talk about the need to make people much more literate and aware when it comes to pension planning, so that they know what the options are for them. So there's a real stress on that through the white paper, and certainly there are things that we have responsibility for right now in making sure we're teaching children the right thing in our schools is one of them. And the curriculum for excellence, of course, is all about making sure that young people are not just learning facts and figures, they're actually learning skills that help them to navigate their way through life. On the point about the banks, I mean, it won't surprise you to hear that I don't entirely share your characterisation of the banking crisis and its implications for an independent Scotland. It sometimes amuses me when the banks were successful, or at least thought to be successful, in the corporation tax was flowing into the coffers of the Treasury. I'm pretty sure they were always described as British banks in those days. It was only when they crashed that they suddenly became Scottish banks. The fact of the matter is, if Scotland had been independent then, we would have cooperated with the rest of the UK. RBS is a Scottish headquartered bank. Most of its UK operations are outside of Scotland. We'd have cooperated to stabilise the banking system, because it would have been as it was, in the overwhelming interests, systemic interests of our financial system. RBS got financial support from the Federal Reserve in America. So, these are international issues, and that's, how we would have cooperated had we been independent. I think the big thing for the future is to make sure we never, ever, ever get into a situation again where we have the same kind of instability leading to the crash of the banks that we saw in recent years. Bruce, I saw and paid close attention to the research that you published last week, I think it was, wasn't it? I suppose the two questions, yours and Martin's, kind of run into each other a little bit. We've all got a responsibility to try to inform. The white paper does that. We try to inform. I'm not going to pretend I'm impartial in this debate. I think you would have seen through me by now if I'd tried to pretend that. The other side are not impartial either. So we all have our contribution to make. David Hume Institute, organisations like this also have a contribution to make. The media, dare I say it, I see at least one journalist in the room, I'm not sure if there are more, have a contribution to make. Individuals themselves have a responsibility to take to make sure that they are finding the information that they say that they want and taking time to read that. One of the things I would say is I feel, and this is not the only reason why I think we should do it, we've got a vested interest in making people informed because, as you would expect, we do lots of private polling. And all of our polling tells us that as people move from feeling uninformed to well-informed, then they also are more likely to move from no to undecided to yes. So we've got a big vested interest in making people informed. And Martin, the white paper is described as aspirational. I will never, ever, as long as I live, accept the term aspirational as a criticism. I think it's right. I don't think we're aspirational enough in Scotland. So, you know, I'll always take aspirational as a compliment. But you're right. You know, there are people with vested interests and, you know, settled views on this, and we need to make sure that the debate is happening in all different parts of society in the country. I attend events like this all the time just now. There are great events happening in every sector, in every part of Scotland, where people are getting the opportunity to hear the arguments on both sides. Is there an objective truth to be had in all of this? I don't know whether we'll ever reach that point. People have to hear the arguments. We have the responsibility to give them the information as we see it, and then people have to make up their minds, and every single one of us is going to have to come to that point where we make up our minds. I've already done so, in case you hadn't noticed that, but everybody is going to have to reach that point. But there is a lot of information out there. It's about making sure that people know where to get it, but ultimately nobody can make the decision for you. You have to make that decision for yourselves.
Thank you. I'm going to ask you one question, if I may, and then squeeze in two final questions. In your talk, you said you saw there is no reason why they, the UK government, should not also accept the common sense position that Scotland and the rest of the UK should share a currency. What happens if they don't accept that common sense position? What happens if they refuse to contemplate a currency union? What's plan B?
I would think it's more for them to say what is plan B, given the difficulties it would create for the rest of the UK. I mean, I'm not going to get into what's plan B, because as soon as I say what's plan B, you'll say what's plan C. Plan A is our plan, because it's the one that is best, not just for Scotland, but for the rest of the UK. I mean, let me try and see it from the point of view of a UK government. Scotland is your second biggest export market after the United States of America. Oil and gas exports are contributing massively to your balance of payments. You take oil and gas exports out of the balance of payments and it makes it look even shakier perhaps than it does at the moment. Significant implications for the strength of sterling. I'm still talking as the UK government here, by the way. My businesses are saying to me, why on earth would you force us into a separate currency with our second biggest export market? What Westminster government, thinking about its own self-interest, is going to say, no, we're going to ignore all of that and force our own businesses, our own citizens into a separate currency? That's why I don't think it is going to happen. You'll hear, of course, lots of stuff just now about how, oh, it's very unlikely or it's very difficult. That will be different once the reality is upon us. And I think the common sense position we saw expressed around the debt situation this week, where it's debt issued by the UK government as a matter of law, they are liable to pay it. But of course, Scotland would seek to make a fair contribution to the servicing of that debt, assuming there was equally a fair distribution of assets.
Okay. Let's take two last questions. There's a gentleman in a white shirt here and a lady over there in a multicoloured sweater. So if we can have two crackers to finish off with, please. Right, sir.
Peter Hutchinson. Given that the Eurozone is looking for more fiscal integration to deal with the fundamental problems with the euro, do you see the similarities with the UK and needing more fiscal integration for the pound to be stable?
Okay, thank you. And the lady?
Elizabeth Meehan. I want to go back to embassies, and embassies are more than consular services or trade missions. They're about intergovernmental relations. And you've already said that in the EU, the Scottish interest tends to be downgraded to what is seen as the UK interest from a particular vantage point. If we're a sort of junior partner sharing an embassy, how would you ensure that Scottish foreign policy interests were thoroughly represented in a shared embassy?
Just two. I'll take the embassy's point first of all. I probably gave the wrong impression here. I wasn't suggesting that we would share all of our embassies. I was simply making the point that it is commonplace these days, or becoming more commonplace, for different countries to share embassies. But I would expect Scotland to have a network of embassies of its own, making sure that our interests were protected. And I ran through, in response to the question here, the 5 core functions that we set out in the white paper. It's on page 228. If you have a copy, you can read it. Where very clearly commercial interests, but the intergovernmental functions that you speak about, culture, big thing for Scotland is to make sure our culture is exported and promoted internationally. Development, we feel we've got a big responsibility, albeit a small country, to international aid and development, and consular, to provide assistance to our citizens when they need it, when they're abroad. So that full spectrum of functions that you would expect from embassies. So I'm not suggesting all of our embassies would be shared. I'm simply making the point that it may be the case in some countries, for some circumstances, we would choose to share facilities, most likely with the rest of the UK, but perhaps with other countries if that suited our purposes. Peter, your question about the Eurozone, I mean, I don't accept the sort of premise that the Eurozone and what happened in the Eurozone translates to a sterling currency zone. The Eurozone ran into trouble for a lot of reasons, so I'm oversimplifying here, but it's a currency zone that encompasses the poorest parts of Greece and the richest parts of Germany. Massive difference in productivity and economic performance. That's not the case across the UK. The UK, Scotland and the rest of the UK would be a optimal currency zone. Productivity levels very similar, employment levels very similar, economic performance not as wildly divergent as you see in the Eurozone. So I think the fundamental basis for a currency zone is there. Of course, in the White Paper and the work of our Fiscal Commission has set this out very explicitly. Of course, you would need certain agreements to underpin and support a sterling currency zone, agreements on overall levels of debt and borrowing. I could argue that it may be more in Scotland's interest of those agreements, given that it's the UK government that's run up £1.3 trillion worth of debt, and we balance the books every year, albeit because we don't have a choice, but nevertheless we still do it. So those agreements, yes, would be necessary, but I think, in fact, I've no doubt that arrangement would work and is a world apart from the Eurozone. Of course, the big benefit, even within a currency union, is the fiscal independence we get to do some of the things I was talking about in my remarks.
Well, thank you very much. We could go on for a long time, but I'm drawing it to a close there because I said we'd finish at 7:30, and that is the hour now. For those of you who want to listen again, a recording of this will be on the website, and for those, and perhaps you can draw it to the attention of others who should be as informed as you now are following this event, and there will also be an access to a copy of the speech as well. For those of you who want to know more about the answers to the no questions, of course, next week Joanne Lamont will be here, and I hope that you will join us for the other 4 seminars in this series, because I think the end product will be to cast more light, and we really could not have begun with a more informed, a more light-casting talk. David Hume has referred to well-tempered eloquence, and I think we've had a very good example of that tonight. So thank you very much, Nicola, for coming along. Thank you all for being with us. You're all now very welcome to have a glass of wine and to discuss further. And I'm very grateful to our sponsors. I'm very grateful to the Young Academy. And I'm particularly grateful, and I'd like you to show your thanks, to our speaker tonight, Nicola Sturgeon.